Right, welcome back everybody to Left the Chat. We are continuing today on Capital by Karl Marx, Part 3, the production of absolute surplus value. Part 3 covers chapters 7 through 9, so we'll begin by talking about chapter 7, which is titled The Labor Process and the Valorization Process. In this chapter, Marx goes into more detail about that, laying out that labor process that he brought up in the previous chapters, and more into detail about valorization, which again is turning money into more money, essentially money prime. So Marx starts out the chapter with a very memorable quote that he says, we have to consider the labor process independently of any specific social formation. And of course, Marx's whole analysis is the labor theory of value, and it's based around labor. And he says that labor is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself. And like we discussed last time, labor power is a commodity that's bought and sold on the market in order to create something of use value with their labor. And Marx says the capitalist sets the worker to produce a particular use value, a specific article. And then he talks about identifying the duality in the labor process, and he says that labor is a process between man and nature. Steve, do you want to talk a little bit of what he means about that?
Yeah, so Marx actually specifically says, page 283, that man confronts nature as a force of nature. He adopts nature to fulfill his needs, but this process changes both nature and man. And this passage really was near and dear to my heart because it reminded me of another great thinker, Mori Bookchin, who ended up creating a thought called social ecology of philosophy. And can be pretty much summed up in the idea that all of our ecological problems are actually the result of deep-seated social problems. So I liked that Marx was kind of acknowledging this relationship that man has to nature, and that we can't separate those two things. And Harvey actually goes in his lecture chapter, gave a really good example. He talked about how at the end of World War II, there was a consumption crisis. People weren't going out and buying things. So the powers that be kind of decided that we were going to create new urban spaces. And those urban spaces ended up being what we now know as suburbs. So they pushed people out of the cities and had them go and buy houses, right? And this had tremendous ecological and social ramifications. By people leaving cities that are mostly composed of, tall buildings where people are living very densely together. All of a sudden, we have this huge sprawl. We're destroying large swaths of the ecosystems to place houses, to place roads, to place parks, and all sorts of other things. And beyond that, it has real social ramifications too, because people are all of a sudden having to take large debts, right, to purchase these houses. Where that before, a lot of people just rented inside of urban centers, right? So my point about that is that, there was a decision, the social decision that was made that all of us, hey, we're no longer going to live in cities. We're going to go out and live in these suburbs where everybody's going to own their own house. And this had tremendous ecological ramifications behind it. And to bring it to the modern era, I think that moving forward as socialists and leftist thinkers, we really need to get a better understanding of urban design to facilitate the kind of culture that we want to create. Because I think that the kind of urban spaces that we create facilitate the kind of people that we end up doing. There's a difference between a suburbanite and an urbanite.
Yeah, right.
Values. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot. It's not necessarily deforestation, but just in the surrounding Miami suburbs, there's houses being being built all the time, these suburban communities, and it's essentially their forests and stuff being broken down. And I don't know necessarily.
Yeah, draining the Everglades.
Yeah, exactly. To just build more housing. And
I remember growing up. Sorry, go ahead.
No, at the same time, I don't know who's able to afford these houses, especially now. post-COVID and post-pandemic, it kind of brings back memories of the housing crisis in 2007.
For sure, for sure. All I was gonna say was like to your very good point down here in South Florida, that constant push west into the Everglades. I remember growing up. We're 30 years old now or whatever, but back when I was a kid, I don't remember Pepper Pines and Miramar Weston and stuff like that.
Right.
Those were very, very small communities. And then as we grew up in my teens, all of a sudden, all these highways were built, and like these new communities were these residential gated communities started popping up more and more to the west of Pines and stuff like that, and that's has had ramifications to our local ecology, to
right.
the Everglades.
So yeah, taking it back to Chapter 7 and where Marx is talking about nature, he points out that we as humans our labor, as opposed to animal labor, is exclusively human. We have an idea and make it real, whereas like animals act on instinct to build their own housing. And Marx uses this analogy of spiders and bees, and at the same time he brings up a human architect, like as opposed to bees who just create these beehives out of instinct and necessity. The architect Marx says the architect buys the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. So Marx really gives conception of ideas a vital role to conscious action.
Yeah, that's. I think I remember Harvey in his lecture specifically mentioning this passage because, a lot of people like to, I guess, put Marx in a box and say, well, he's just a pure materialist. You know what I mean? But I think I remember Harvey saying how like this is kind of a passage of him saying, that he's not just exclusively a materialist. There's a role of idealism in his ideas.
Right, and yeah, and by materialist, I mean, and Harvey explains this. He talks how Marx is typically credited by like people being like their ideas being a product of their environment, like their material.
Right. Yeah. Like their material circumstances determine the ideas that they end up creating.
Right. So yeah, with this little part of this little section, Marx is kind of countering that misconception of his idea. So then going into directly about the labor process, Marx lays it out in three different parts of the labor process. He says purposeful activity, that is work itself, the object on which that work is performed, and the instruments of that work. And that's page 284 of the Penguin Classics Capital version. So break those three things down. Purposeful activity is work itself. So for example, if you take the example of building a table, the human action performed by the laborer is the purposeful activity. The second part of the process is objects that which that work is performed on. So using that same example, it's the raw materials, so it'd be the wood, the metal, and then the instruments of that work, which are the tools. So building a table, let's say you need a saw, a hammer, etc. So you have the purposeful activity, the actual labor, the objects that the work is performed on, the wood, the metal, and the instruments such as the tools that you use. So those second and third factors are what then Marx calls the means of production.
Yeah, this was a big section of the book that I felt like I had to unpack, and like I think I want to spend just a little bit of time here because, I think at one of our previous videos we talk a lot about the critiques of the labor theory of value, and here kind of Marx starts to really home in on that and what he means by the source of values in labor, right? And he kind of starts defining what machines do, what are the instruments of labor, what do they contribute to the process. So for example, on page 287, he says, if we look at the whole process from the point of view of the result, the product, it is plain that both the instruments and the object of labor are means of production, and that labor itself is a productive labor. And he goes on and he says, although a use value emerges from the labor process in the form of a product, other use values, products of previous labor, enter into it as means of production. The same use value is both the product of a previous process and a means of product in a later process. Products are therefore not only results of labor, but also essential conditions. With the exception of extractive industries such as mining, where the material of labor is provided by nature, every object of labor which has already been filtered through the labor process, which is itself already a product of labor. So I thought this was interesting because basically, if I remember our discussion, that's kind of one of the interpretations that people like modern Marxists take with the labor theory of value, right? That we should consider machines as just previously congealed labor time, or the previous labor in the past that has created something and now new labor is using it. And I guess at the time, since we hadn't gotten to these chapters, we were kind of, I guess at least I thought that was just something that new Marxists kind of like, made their own interpretations on or expanded on. But this is something that Marx actually says is himself. You know what I mean? Like, hey, like machines are just previous things that other people in the past made. And that's
right. He uses a lot the term dead labor, and that's that dead labor that's congealed in past products. So using that table example again, the hammer, for example, which is now a means of production, it's also a product of that labor process, because obviously somebody had to build that build that hammer, right?
Right. And that last thing where he was talking about, how certain extractive industries like mining and stuff like that, that's just kind of like, there's no previous labor involved in the creation of an ore, right? It's just provided by nature. And, I kind of, really shitted on him at the beginning, because I was like, yeah, like, he just keeps calling these things the free gifts of nature, but it's not really free, whatever, it carries all these costs. But, I kind of have to, retract my statement a little bit, because I kind of forgot something really fundamental, which I think we talked about at the beginning, of this whole series that we got going on, which is Marx is describing the capitalist mode of production, not his like ideal form of production. And he's exactly right. Capitalists don't give a shit about nature. They view it as a free gift of nature. You know what I mean? So that's something that I kind of like had to remind myself of, is like, this isn't Marx is trying to explain his ideal form of the modes of the production that he thinks a society should do. He's just saying, capitalists treat nature as free gifts of nature. So that's what they are. And that's how that's how I'm treating them in my analysis.
Marx says, whenever a product enters a means of production into a new labor process, it thereby loses its character of product and becomes a mere factor in the process. So what Marx is saying here is that, while a hammer can be bought as a commodity, once it's then being used to create a new commodity, it ceases to be a commodity and is now a means of production. Do you want to say something as far as that?
Yeah. Like, I think this is just like Marx, this kind of section of the book, he's just driving home his point that labor alone is what creates use values. That's kind of his position. To your point, machines and other, he kind of interchanges between instruments of labor and means of production, but I've interpreted them mean the same thing. But, that they're essentially just, tools that, lying fallow can't do anything unless labor comes and like does something to them. And I just wanted to make the point here that this, kind of begs the question, and I think we've touched upon this before, about automation. Of course, someone originally creates a machine, but what about, the use values that are subsequently created by that machine? And then I kind of posed the question here, I know, which we'll eventually get to in chapter 8, which he answers, but like, are we to understand that like a machine, for each discrete unit of product that machine creates, are we like fractionizing its original value to each product? So like, for example, if a machine is worth, can produce 1,000 units over its lifetime, does each unit need to be understood as, okay, the machine is transferring 1/1000th of its value into the first unit, and then the next 1/1000th to the next unit, and whatever, And I can kind of understand his train of thought, with like material things in that way. But this is something I think that Marx couldn't foresee. But I don't know if that translates to digital products. Like if I create a program, or somebody creates a program that creates user profiles, right, on Facebook, I wrote a function that does that. That thing can essentially run forever. You know what I mean? Like forever and ever. It doesn't deteriorate. The only limit that it has is energy. The energy running the computers at whatever. But I just thought that was an interesting point, is that, I guess people criticize him for that, but like, how the hell was he going to predict digital computers and digital products and digital things?
Right. Yeah. Like you said, we'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about constant capital and variable capital in chapter 8. But just to that point, even to that extent, somebody still needs to create that program, right? So as far as I know, even though it could be a program that infinitely runs forever, as far as I know right now, and maybe somebody can think of an example, but there isn't any production process or industry that requires, right, no human labor as
Right.
as of yet.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. I know, and I think which was great, because at the end of the lecture, somebody actually questions Harvey about this. He's like, "What about the idea of?" I think he uses the phrase "lights off factories that are basically completely automated. Where does the value come from there?" And Harvey
right.
kind of stumbles a little bit here, but he essentially kind of says, like, you got to, like, to your point, you got to be careful when you say fully automated. Like, number one, somebody has to create the machines, right? But there's probably people maintaining the machine. And
Until we have robots that maintain the machine.
Other robots,
right?
and then, but like even like a Tesla Gigafactory, right? And like people are still delivering material to the factory, right? People are still delivering the cars eventually to the lots. So there's that whole thing. And then he kind of makes a very interesting point here, beyond that kind of point, right? That like nothing has been fully, completely roboticized from beginning to end, right? But also that the most profitable companies now are not the highly automated ones that are like automotive industry and mining and stuff like that. It's all like things like Walmart that are paying their workers shit, right? For the amount of hours worked. That's a super profitable company in the United States. Or, interesting, in our digital age, things like Apple and Microsoft and Google, and it could be argued, that Apple and Microsoft, the products that they make, the MacBooks and stuff like that, there's still Foxconn workers getting paid shit in their factories in China making these things, right? And they're turning them and selling them. And then when in the case of like a Google or Facebook, which are also very highly profitable, it could be argued that we're the source of their value, right? We're giving them all of our data that they ended up turning around and using. So at the end of the day, it's like it's labor is still very, very much a part of our modern process.
Right. One last point in one of Chapter 7, as far as describing the labor process, thing to point out is that, labor is the process of making use values, but under capitalism specifically, this means you're making the use values for someone else in that commodity form. But in this first section of Chapter 7, Marx offers these like, the physical dissections of labor, those 3 steps that we talked about, and these descriptions of the process. But this is still independent of any social formation. So, for example, going back to this table building example, you can describe someone, building a table in all its physical details, but just from looking at them, you can't tell whether they're a slave, a wage laborer, or just like a hobbyist, somebody that enjoys building a table, right? So under capitalism specifically, the labor process, the laborer works under the control of the capitalist, and then that end product of the laborer, that surplus value, in the end belongs to the capitalist to allocate. Moving on to section 2 of chapter 7, Marx then describes how this labor process leads into the valorization process. So it deals directly with the production of that surplus value. So we have to remember that the capitalist is interested in a commodities exchange value, which is determined by that labor time rather than its use value. Us as workers, as laborers, we're interested in products use value, that CMC circulation, and the capitalist is interested in that MCM circulation. The labor time congealed in the commodity includes all of the labor times necessary to create the commodity. So not only the time that it takes to build that table that I keep bringing up as an example, but the portion of the time that it took to create that means of production, like the hammer, like the raw materials needed to create the table. So the time to create the hammer, time to mine the metals, cut the wood, draw the plans, etc. All that congealed labor time in the commodity comes from all those different factors, not just in the labor it takes to build the table itself.
Right, and to your point about the table example, Marx loves yarn and cotton for some reason in this book, but he makes a passage in page 294 and 298 kind of explaining. But I'll use your table example. But he makes a point to keep mentioning the fact that when you take those inputs, right, in your case the table, right. So when you're creating a table, you take the inputs of the wood, the nails, the metals, all that stuff. But when you put it all together, the value of all of those things is equivalent to the table, right? Mm-hmm. So like, he uses this passage of like, oh, our capitalist stares in astonishment. The value of the product is equal to the value of the capital advanced. The value advanced has not been valorized. no surplus value is created, and consequently no money has been transformed into capital. I thought that was very important. It's like, it's not just by capitalist buys all of these input raw materials, and then out comes a table, and the table somehow magically becomes more valuable. No, it's equivalent to the same amount. Like, you maybe have spent, for example, $50 on the cost of the wood and the cost of the hammer and the cost of the metal and the cost of the labor. But at the end of it, you got a table worth $50. You know what I'm saying? So like, and he makes that point because it's going to lead to the next point, which I'm sure you're going to talk about right now. Is like, all right, so where does the surplus value come from?
Right, exactly. And Marx, of course, being a sucker for all these equations, MCM, CMC, all that, he talks about the form of circulation under capitalism that leads to surplus value as the following equation. M to C is LP. I'll describe this in a second. LP divided by MP, which leads to P, which leads to C, to M plus M prime. So closely, that's a bunch of letters to describe. But
yeah, you
closely,
lost me there, man.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have a graphic at the.
That'll be helpful. So to explain that, the MP, the capitalist has to buy the MP, the means of production, which includes the raw materials, the machinery, all those products of past congealed labor. Then the capitalist has to employ or purchase labor power, LP. Then the labor process occurs, P, in which MP and LP are transformed into commodities. So that means of production and the labor power is transformed into commodities. And then the commodities in the end are then sold for more money, which he describes as M prime. So to summarize what you were just talking about, also the value is being added, in that labor process. It's not just an equal exchange of, you buy these raw materials and then you sell it for what you bought the raw materials for. That extra added value is being added in that labor process. And of course, the profit for the capitalist is only possible if the laborer added more value, which Marx calls surplus value, to the product than what he is compensated for. If the laborer is then just compensated exactly for what the means of production costs, then the capitalist is then not making any profit.
Right, and I think towards the end of this chapter, he kind of starts defining, what that kind of idea of surplus. He doesn't name it yet, but he kind of starts talking about like where exactly it comes from. So on page 301 to 302 of Capital, he says, the owner of money has paid the value of a day's labor power. He therefore has the use of it for a day. A day's labor belongs to him. On the other hand, the daily sustenance of labor power costs only half a day's labor. While on the other hand, the very same labor power can remain effective, can work during the whole day. And consequently, the value which it's used during one day creates is double what the capitalist pays for its use. So here he starts kind of teasing that whole idea of, the capitalist is extending the amount of time that you're working than what he actually pays you to work, and this was hit home for me, particularly in these last couple of months, because basically the whole idea here is that the price of what he pays isn't equivalent to the total hours or time worked, right? And this is, in my case, is especially seen in salaried work, right? Like, I agreed to a certain salary for a certain amount of hours, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm only going to work 40 hours, right? Like I could be like the guy could just extend the time I'm working, and then all of a sudden I'm just adding value without really getting paid for it. And I think that's, he starts setting that whole kind of thing at the end of this chapter.
Right. Or specifically like in the production of an actual commodity, I think maybe we brought up like an example of the production of shoes or something like that. A laborer, it's minimum wage, $7.25 an hour or whatever, but they produce 10 pairs of shoes in an hour, and then those shoes are then sold for $60, $100 a pop, something like that.
Right. If you're an hourly wage worker, then that kind of example would hit home for you. Because you're producing products, more products during a certain period of time, and their value is much higher than what you're getting paid for that same hour.
Salary to that extent, I'm somewhat grateful that I'm an hourly employee for that reason, because they can't, outside of working hours, can't ask me to do extra work. But yeah, salary work for that reason is it's kind of astonishing to me.
Do you get measured on how many videos you edit and on a day and shit like that?
I mean, they're interested in seeing where our progress is, but no, it could be like, I mean, yeah,
That's
I mean,
nice, because I'm thinking like, well, maybe because you get paid hourly, but they're probably watching like how many videos is Jay pushing out, every hour.
It's a little different, yeah. One thing I wanted to bring up when you brought up a quote a little while ago about where you said our capitalist stares in astonishment. I wanted to point out that one thing I really enjoyed about Marx's writing in Chapter 7 is his taking this kind of sarcastic tone and like describing the plight of the capitalist, and then he kind of just in the end he just like kind of shits on him after that. But he kind of,
I like that. I like that a lot as well. Like those little like kind of like he does it randomly in a chapter too. Like he's like it's very theoretical, and then all of a sudden he has a chapter. It's like, well, let's go check in on our boy the capitalist and see how he's doing. And then, like. I like those little stories that goes in there.
Throughout Capital, he kind of takes different writing styles, I guess, varying chapter by chapter. Some chapters are just straight theory, and then like when we talk about Chapter 10 next time, it's kind of very descriptive and more narrative. So in this chapter, he kind of goes back and forth between theory and kind of describing that plight of the capitalist. And speaking of that plight of the capitalist, he talks about how capitalists give, this litany of virtuous excuses as to why they deserve the surplus value. We hear this argument all the time today. Capitalists, they invest this money, they provide employment or they create jobs, and they work hard by setting up the production process, they manage things, and they take all this risk, right? And we kind of talked about last time, the capitalists, sure, they're taking a risk, but at the same time, workers are taking somewhat of an equivalent risk, right? And Marx says on page 300 with regards to all these, excuses that the capitalist gives, he says the whole litany the capitalist has just recited was simply meant to pull the wool over our eyes. And Harvey says in his companion that Marx's point is that capitalists couldn't possibly sustain the whole system by these appeals to virtue, morality, or benevolence, that the individual behavior of capitalists varying from benevolence to vicious greed is irrelevant to what capitalists must do in order to be capitalists, which is to procure surplus value. Their role is defined, as Marx will later point out in these coming chapters, by coercive laws of competition, which push all capitalists to behave in similar fashion, no matter whether they are good people or proverbial capitalist pigs. So we talked about this, and Marx kind of brought it up towards the beginning of the book also, how, whether capitalists or workers, we're all slaves, for lack of a better word, to the capitalist system, right? And these laws of competition. So whether these capitalists are virtuous or not, they're still out to get each other, right?
It's all a consequence of commodity production, which is why he starts with the commodity, right? It all goes back to that. We all decided, or not we all decided, long time ago, merchant capital or whatever decided that we're simply going to start producing commodities, and then now we're living with the consequences of that.
So that about does it for Chapter 7. In these coming next chapters, join us in the next video where we'll discuss 8 and 9, where Marx will seek to clarify and structure his whole theory of surplus value.
Thank you, guys.